By all historical rights, the Civil War should have destroyed us as a nation. By all historical rights, the skeptics, the aristocrats, the despots should have rejoiced.
Most people think the Civil War was just grainy photos of stoic men and dusty battlefields. But history has a basement, and the things locked inside don't make sense. We're talking about a world where vampire soldiers rose from the dead. A CSS submarine became a literal metal coffin for 3 separate crews, and a runaway slave stole a Confederate ship right under the general's nose. You've heard the legends. Now it's time to see the receipts. The fog of war. Let's be honest, most of what we learn about the Civil War in school is pretty dry. It's a lot of dates, names of guys with massive beards, and maps with red and blue arrows. It feels like ancient history, distant, dusty, and honestly, a little boring. Because of that, whenever someone brought up a story that sounded a bit out there, we usually just rolled our eyes. We figured it was just old-timey exaggeration. We assumed that after 4 years of literal hell, the soldiers just started seeing things or making up tall tales to deal with the trauma. But here's the thing. History has a basement, and it's full of stuff that makes no sense. For over 100 years, people talked about glowing wounds on the battlefield or ghost ships that disappeared into thin air. These stories were treated like urban legends. They were the kind of things you'd hear from a guy who'd had too much whiskey. We called them myths because we didn't have the tools to prove they were real. We put them in the same category as Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. Then, everything changed. Lately, we've started using tech that sounds like it's from a sci-fi movie. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced DNA testing, and deep-sea robots. And guess what? We're finding out that the crazy stories were actually true the whole time. We're finding the shipwrecks exactly where the legends said they were. We're finding the biological proof for things that should be impossible. It turns out that the truth isn't just stranger than the stories, it's way more intense. When we look back at the 60s now, it's not just a bunch of old photos. It's a series of moments where the world felt like it was glitching. We're talking about events that made tough-as-nails soldiers question their sanity. Forget the textbooks for a second. We're not here for the grand speeches or the politics. We're here for the anomalies. We're here for the stuff that was too weird to be believed until we actually saw the proof. History isn't just sitting there in the past. It's a giant puzzle we're still putting together. And some of the pieces are absolutely wild. But if you want to talk about things that shouldn't exist, you have to start at the bottom of the ocean. The Devil's Iron. If you're looking for a story that feels like a cursed horror movie, look no further than the CSS Hunley. This was the Confederacy's secret weapon, the first combat submarine to ever sink an enemy warship. On paper, it was a genius move. In reality, it was a 30-foot-long iron coffin that spent more time killing its own crew than the Union Navy. For over a century, the details of its final mission were considered one of the biggest mysteries in military history. People came up with all sorts of wild theories about why it vanished right after its big win. Some thought the crew panicked and drowned in the dark. Others thought they were hit by a lucky shot and sank slowly while trying to swim for it. The story of the Hunley is actually a trilogy of disasters. It didn't just sink once, it sank 3 times. The first time, it was swamped by the wake of a passing ship, and 5 men died. They hauled the sub up, cleaned it out, and found a new crew. The second time, it suffered a mechanical failure during a practice dive, and all 8 men on board, including the guy who invented the thing, Horace Hunley, suffered a slow, agonizing death at the bottom of the harbor. You would think that after 13 deaths, someone would have said, maybe this is a bad idea. But the war was getting desperate. They pulled it up a 3rd time, scrubbed the walls again, and called for more volunteers. It's hard to imagine the courage or the pure insanity it took to crawl into that cramped, dark tube knowing exactly what happened to the last 2 crews. On the night of February 17, 1864, the Hunley finally did what it was built to do. It crept out into the dark waters toward the USS Housatonic. The crew was literally hand-cranking a propeller in total darkness, breathing stale air, and hoping the candle they used for light wouldn't go out, because if the candle went out, it meant they were out of oxygen. They rammed a torpedo into the side of the Housatonic, backed away, and watched the Union ship explode and sink. They even signaled back to the shore with a blue lantern to say they were coming home, but they never showed up. For 131 years, the Hunley was a ghost. When researchers finally found the wreck in 1995 and raised it in 2000, they expected to find a scene of absolute chaos inside. They assumed that as the water rushed in, the 8 men would have scrambled for the hatches, clawing over each other in a desperate bid to survive. But when the scientists finally removed the silt and looked inside, the world went silent. The crew wasn't huddled at the exits. They were still sitting at their stations. Their skeletal hands were still near the cranks. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, and the bilge pumps hadn't even been turned on. It was like they had all just decided to go to sleep at the exact same moment. This discovery turned the mystery into a full-blown paranormal puzzle. It wasn't until 2017 that we got the real answer. Scientists at Duke University spent years running blast tests on a scale model of the sub. They realized that the torpedo wasn't a projectile. It was a bomb on the end of a long pole. When it exploded, the pressure wave traveled through the water and slammed into the iron hull. The hull didn't break, but the shock wave passed right through the metal and into the lungs and brains of the men inside. It caused immediate, massive internal bleeding. They didn't drown. They were essentially turned off by physics. The legend of the ghost crew wasn't a myth. It was a scientific anomaly, frozen in a rusted iron tube. But if a metal tube is a scary place to be, try being a slave on a ship you're about to steal. The General's Thief. In May 1862, if you were a Confederate officer in Charleston, you were feeling pretty good about yourself. You had the best defenses, the best ships, and a social hierarchy that you thought was set in stone. One of your prized assets was the CSS Planter, a high-speed transport ship used as the personal flagship for General Roswell Ripley. It was a symbol of Southern power, but on the night of May 12th, the white officers in charge of the Planter made a classic, arrogant mistake. They decided to spend the night on shore at a party, leaving the ship in the hands of the enslaved crew. They figured the crew was too uneducated or too scared to do anything but sit tight. They couldn't have been more wrong. Among those men was Robert Smalls. Smalls wasn't just a laborer. He was a brilliant pilot who had spent years memorizing every sandbar, every naval signal, and every hidden mine in the Charleston harbor. He had been planning an escape for months, and this was his shot. But he wasn't just looking to run away into the woods. He wanted to take the General's favorite ship, his own family, and the families of his crew members with him. It was a plan so ballsy that most people at the time, and for decades after, refused to believe a single person could pull it off. They called it Northern propaganda, until the official naval logs were declassified. At 3 a.m., Smalls put on the captain's tall straw hat and long coat. From a distance, in the dark, he looked just like the man in charge. He backed the ship out of the dock and picked up his wife and children at a secret meeting point. Then came the hard part. To get to the Union blockade, he had to pass 5 Confederate forts, including the massive guns of Fort Sumter. If he messed up a single signal, the Planter would be blown out of the water in seconds. Smalls didn't panic. At every checkpoint, he blew the steam whistle in the exact rhythm required and gave the secret hand signals he'd watched the captain perform 1,000 times. He even folded his arms and leaned against the railing just like the captain did. The sentries at Fort Sumter watched the ship pass in the pre-dawn mist and simply waved it through, thinking the general was off on an early morning mission. It wasn't until the Planter passed the final gun and accelerated toward the Union fleet that the Confederates realized the general wasn't on board. Smalls quickly took down the rebel flag and hoisted a white bedsheet. He pulled up alongside a Union ship, tipped his hat, and famously shouted, "Good morning, sir. I've brought you some of the old United States guns." He didn't just deliver a ship. He delivered the Confederate codebook and a map of all the mines in the harbor. The story was so legendary that many Southerners claimed for years that the Union must have sent a secret commando team to steal the ship because they couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of Smalls doing it himself. But the records don't lie. Smalls became a war hero, a naval captain, and eventually a U.S. congressman. He proved that the most dangerous weapon in the war wasn't a cannon. It was a man who had been underestimated by everyone around him. But while Smalls was stealing ships in the dark, Other soldiers were seeing something even weirder, wounds that started to glow. The angel's glow. After the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, the woods of Tennessee felt like the literal porch of hell. It was one of the bloodiest encounters in American history, leaving over 23,000 men dead or wounded in just 2 days. The rain was relentless, the mud was thick, and the medical tents were completely overwhelmed. Thousands of soldiers were left lying in the freezing muck for 2 full nights because the medics simply couldn't get to them fast enough. As night fell on the second day, the survivors started noticing something that made them think they'd finally lost their minds. Their open, jagged wounds weren't just festering, they were emitting a soft, flickering blue-green light. In the pitch black of the Tennessee woods, it looked like the forest was filled with thousands of tiny, dying stars. The men started calling it Angel's Glow. To a dying 19-year-old soldier in 1862, there was only one explanation. God had sent down literal angels to mark the survivors. But the story got even weirder when the sun came up and the medics finally reached them. They noticed that the soldiers whose wounds had glowed in the dark were actually in much better shape than the ones whose wounds stayed dark. The glowing soldiers had lower rates of infection and were significantly more likely to survive their surgeries. For 140 years, this was the ultimate Civil War tall tale. Historians lumped it in with ghost stories and battlefield hallucinations. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel. Magic healing light that saves you from gangrene? Yeah, okay. It was dismissed as a collective delusion, brought on by shock and exhaustion. That was until 2001, when a high school student named Bill Martin heard the legend and asked a simple question. Could a bacteria have done it? Most adults probably would have said no. But Bill and his friend John Curtis decided to treat this myth like a cold case. They discovered a specific type of soil-dwelling bacteria called Photorhabdus luminescens. This stuff is bioluminescent, meaning it glows in the dark, and it lives inside tiny worms called nematodes. When the nematodes find a host, usually an insect, they barf up the bacteria, which then produces a chemical that kills off any competing germs. Basically, the bacteria acts like a natural, glowing antibiotic. But there was one massive problem with the theory. This bacteria can't survive at human body temperature. The human body is way too hot for it to grow. Then, the boys looked at the weather reports from the Battle of Shiloh. Those men hadn't just been lying in the mud. They'd been lying in freezing rain and sleet for nearly 48 hours. They were all suffering from severe hypothermia. Their body temperatures had dropped significantly below the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, creating the perfect, chilly environment for Photorhabdus luminescens to move in and set up shop. The bacteria moved into the wounds, killed off the lethal bad bacteria that would have caused gangrene, and gave off a blue glow as a byproduct. When the soldiers were finally brought into the warm medical tents, their body temperatures rose, the glowing bacteria died off, and they were left with clean, infection-free wounds. The angel's glow wasn't a miracle or a myth. It was a freak occurrence of biotech before we even knew what that word meant. It took 140 years and a couple of teenagers with a science project to prove that the soldiers weren't crazy. They were just the first people to ever be saved by a glowing, soil-dwelling medicine. While some soldiers were being saved by a glow, others were about to face a psychological glitch that defied every law of military logic. The ghost of the 20th. If you go to Gettysburg today, Little Round Top is one of the most visited spots on the planet. It looks like a peaceful, rocky hill. But on July 2nd, 1863, it was the literal hinge of the American experiment. If that hill fell, the Union line would have folded like a card table, and the war would have likely ended right there. The men holding the far left of that line were the 20th Maine, led by a college professor named Joshua Chamberlain. They had been told to hold the position at all costs. After hours of brutal, face-to-face fighting against the 15th Alabama, they were out of ammo. They were exhausted, bleeding, and staring down one last Confederate charge that they knew they couldn't stop with empty rifles. Then, Chamberlain did something that made no sense. He didn't order a retreat, and he didn't tell his men to surrender. He swung his sword and yelled, "Bayonets!" The 20th Maine didn't just stand their ground. They charged down the hill like a swinging door. This story is famous, but for a long time people thought the official version was a bit too perfect. Critics argued that a bunch of starving, out-of-ammo soldiers couldn't possibly have terrified a veteran Confederate unit into surrendering just by running at them with knives. It sounded like a hero's myth created by Chamberlain to secure his legacy. But as historians started digging into the letters and diaries of the men who were actually there, especially the guys on the Confederate side, a much weirder picture started to emerge. It wasn't just a charge, it was a psychological glitch. The Alabamians were coming up a steep wooded hill. They were dehydrated, overheated, and had been fighting for hours. When the 20th Maine came screaming down at them, the Confederates didn't just see soldiers. In the smoke and the chaos, they thought they were being attacked by a much larger force that had somehow appeared out of nowhere. One of the most unbelievable parts of the story that turned out to be true was the ghostly appearance of a man in a revolutionary-style uniform leading the charge. For years, veterans swore they saw a figure that looked like George Washington riding a white horse through the trees, guiding the Union soldiers. Most modern historians dismissed this as a mass hallucination caused by heat stroke. But whether it was a ghost or just a collective burst of adrenaline, the effect was real. The Confederates, who were among the toughest fighters in the South, simply dropped their guns. Hundreds of them surrendered to men who didn't even have bullets in their pockets. When we look at the physics of the swinging gate maneuver Chamberlain used, it shouldn't have worked on that terrain. It was a move designed for a flat parade ground, not a rocky cliffside. But it worked because it violated every rule of engagement the Southerners expected. The myth of the 20th Maine wasn't just a story about bravery. It was a story about how a single impossible moment of crazy can break the reality of a battlefield and change the course of a nation. But while men were fighting ghosts on a hill, a crazy woman in Richmond was running a spy ring in the heart of the Confederacy. The spy in the parlor. If you lived in Richmond during the war, you probably knew Elizabeth Van Lew. And if you knew her, you probably thought she was completely out of her mind. She walked the streets with her hair uncombed, talking to herself, wearing mismatched clothes, and humming nonsense tunes. Everyone called her Crazy Bet, because the high society folks of the Confederate capital were so focused on her eccentric behavior, they never bothered to ask what she was actually doing. They just assumed she was a harmless, wealthy local woman who had lost her marbles under the stress of the war. But Crazy Bet was the ultimate deep-cover persona. Elizabeth Van Lew was actually the head of the Richmond Underground, one of the most effective Union spy rings in history. For decades, historians treated her stories like exaggerated legends. They thought the idea of a woman running a complex intelligence network right under the nose of Confederate President Jefferson Davis was a bit too James Bond for the 60s. That was until a diary was discovered in the 50s. Hidden inside a secret compartment of her mansion, revealing the terrifyingly high stakes of her operation. Elizabeth didn't work alone. Her greatest unbelievable asset was a woman named Mary Bowser. Mary was a former slave from the Van Lew household who had been sent north to be educated. Elizabeth brought her back to Richmond with a plan that sounded like a self-ending mission. They were going to plant Mary as a servant in the Confederate White House. At the time, Confederate leaders were so blinded by their own prejudices that they believed enslaved people were invisible or too unintelligent to understand politics. They would leave top-secret battle plans, troop movements, and supply lists out on their desks while Mary was dusting the furniture. Mary Bowser had a photographic memory. Every night, she would report what she had read to Elizabeth, who would then code the messages and smuggle them across enemy lines to General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant later admitted that he was getting better intelligence from Elizabeth's crazy network than he was from his own scouts. When the Confederates finally realized there was a leak in the highest levels of government, they searched everywhere, except the kitchen and the parlor of the local mad woman. The story of Mary Bowser was so incredible that for a long time, people argued she was a fictional character created to make the Union look better. But modern research in the National Archives has turned up the receipts. We found the records of the Secret Service funds paid to Elizabeth, and we found the coded letters that match up perfectly with the movements of the Union Army. These women didn't just break the rules of society, they used those rules as a shield. They proved that in the middle of a war, the most powerful person in the room is often the one everyone else has decided to ignore. If spying in a parlor was subtle, what happened next was the loudest, most chaotic failure in the history of military engineering. The impossible map. By 1864, the war had ground to a halt. In Petersburg, Virginia, both sides were stuck in a brutal stalemate, living in trenches that looked like a preview of World War I. It was a miserable, muddy deadlock. That's when a group of Pennsylvania coal miners, led by Colonel Henry Pleasants, came up with a plan that sounded like a Looney Tunes cartoon. They proposed digging a 500-foot tunnel underneath the Confederate lines, packing it with 4 tons of gunpowder, and blowing the rebels into the atmosphere. When the generals heard this, they laughed. They said the tunnel would cave in, the air would become unbreathable, and the sheer scale of the excavation was impossible without heavy machinery. For years, the story of the crater was told as a cautionary tale of dumb ideas, but recent geological surveys and LiDAR scans have revealed that the engineering was actually a masterpiece of improvisational genius. The miners used a hollowed-out wooden chimney system to create a vacuum, pulling fresh air into the tunnel so they wouldn't suffocate. They were literally hacking physics in the dark. On July 30th, at 4:44 a.m., they lit the fuse. The explosion was so massive that it created a literal earthquake felt miles away. A hole was ripped into the earth, 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. It was a success beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But then, the unbelievable happened. Instead of running around the massive hole to attack the stunned Confederates, the Union troops, confused and poorly led, charged directly into the crater. They found themselves at the bottom of a 30-foot pit with steep, slippery clay walls. They couldn't get out. The Confederates, after recovering from the shock, simply walked to the edge of the pit and started firing down. It became known as the Battle of the Ants. For over a century, the casualty numbers and the sheer stupidity of the maneuver were debated. People thought the stories of men being trapped in the earth were exaggerations to highlight the incompetence of the Union High Command. But when archaeologists began excavating the site with modern forensic tools, they found the truth was even more grim. They found evidence of a killing zone that was so concentrated it defied the standard ballistics of the time. The sheer density of lead found in the soil proved that the pit of death wasn't just a metaphor. It was a logistical nightmare, where a brilliant technological breakthrough was flushed down the drain by a total lack of common sense. It remains the most surreal what-if of the war, a moment where the Union almost ended the struggle with a bang, only to fall into a hole of their own making. But the war didn't end in a pit. It ended with echoes that we are still hearing today. The epilogue. As we stand here in 2026, the American Civil War can sometimes feel like a ghost that refuses to stay in the attic. We've spent over 160 years dissecting the battles, the speeches, and the statistics. But as we've seen, the most unbelievable parts of the story were the ones we were most likely to ignore. For a long time, we treated history like a finished book. We thought we knew everything there was to know. But if these stories teach us anything, it's that history is never really done. It's a cold case that is constantly being reopened by new eyes and better tools. Think about it. For over a century, the Angel's Glow was just a campfire story. The Hunley was a myth at the bottom of the sea. Robert Smalls's heist was an exaggeration, and the crazy bet spy ring was a footnote about a local eccentric. We dismissed these events because they didn't fit the neat, orderly narrative of what a war is supposed to look like. We didn't believe them because they felt too cinematic, too weird, or too human. But the dirt and the deep water don't lie. When we finally applied forensic science and modern engineering to these tall tales, the truth that came screaming out was more intense than the fiction we'd replaced it with. This matters because of how we look at our own world today. We often think that fact and legend are two completely different things, but the Civil War shows us that they are often the same thing viewed through different lenses. The soldiers at Shiloh didn't need to know about photohabdisluminescence to know they were being saved by a light in the dark. Robert Smalls didn't need a history degree to know that his captor's own arrogance was his greatest weapon. They lived the reality. We just spent 100 years trying to figure out if they were lying. Today, we are still finding things. Every year, a receding riverbank or a construction crew in Virginia uncovers a belt buckle, a coded letter, or a mass grave that shifts our understanding of the conflict. With AI-assisted document analysis and advanced 3D mapping, we are watching the war in a way that previous generations never could. We are seeing the faces of the people who were erased and hearing the voices of the men who saw the impossible. The real Civil War wasn't just a political struggle. It was a surreal, high-stakes laboratory where human nature was pushed to the absolute edge. It was a place where slaves became captains, professors became war heroes, and glowing bacteria became doctors. When people say they don't believe these stories, it's usually because they are looking for a version of history that is comfortable. But history isn't comfortable. It's messy, it's bizarre, and it's full of glitches. So, the next time you hear a story from the past that sounds a little too wild to be true, don't be so quick to write it off. Don't assume that just because it isn't in a standard textbook, it didn't happen. We are still uncovering the receipts for the impossible moments of 1861 to 1865. The more we look, the more we realize that the most riveting parts of our history aren't the things we've always known. They're the things we're only just beginning to believe. History is full of secrets buried just beneath the surface. So hit that subscribe button to make sure you're there when we dig up the next one.